The day I walked into my grandmother's funeral wearing my surgical whites, my father looked at me like I had shown up to a black tie gala in pajamas. I hadn't planned it that way. My shift had run 4 hours over because we lost a patient, a 7-year-old named Elijah, and I had driven straight from the hospital to the church in Macon, with dried coffee on my sleeve and my badge still clipped to my chest. I hadn't even had time to cry at, not for Elijah, not for Grandma Adele. I was running on fumes and grief and the particular kind of numbness that only comes after you've spent 14 hours trying to save someone and failed. My father met me at the church door before I could even step inside. "You couldn't change," he said. Not hello. Not "I'm glad you made it," just that. I told him I came straight from the hospital. He looked at my badge, then back at my face, and all he said was, "Your Uncle Arthur flew in from Seattle. He had time to put on a proper suit." That was my welcome home. I should probably explain something about my father before I go any further, because without context, he sounds like a villain in a movie. He's not. He's just a man who grew up believing that certain things meant certain things. That a pressed collar meant you cared. That a title meant you had arrived. That the loudest person in the room was the one worth listening to. He's a man who measures love in visible effort, and somewhere along the way, he decided that my efforts were never quite visible enough. My name is Adrian. I'm 34 years old. I'm an attending physician in the pediatric emergency department at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, which, if you're not from Georgia, is one of the busiest trauma centers in the southeastern United States. I trained for 11 years after college to do what I do. I have not slept a full 8 hours in so long that the concept feels theoretical. And for most of my adult life, none of that was enough for my father. I grew up in a mid-sized city in central Georgia, the only child of 2 people who worked hard their entire lives and wanted something better for me, but had very different ideas about what better looked like. My mother, who passed when I was 19 from ovarian cancer, wanted me to be happy. She used to say that happiness was a skill, same as any other, and that I needed to practice it. My father wanted me to be impressive. He wanted the kind of success you could point to at church, the kind that made other people's fathers nod slowly with their arms crossed, the kind you could hang on the wall. The problem was that I was a quiet kid, serious, maybe a little awkward, the kind of girl who spent Saturday mornings reading library books instead of going to the mall. My cousin Denise was the one who danced, who cheered, who made my father laugh at every cookout. I was the one in the corner with a book about the human circulatory system. He never said he preferred Denise to me, he never had to. It came out in smaller ways. The way he'd describe her to his friends first, before mentioning me. The way he'd talk about her cheerleading competitions with a brightness in his voice that went flat when he turned to ask me how all that studying was going. The way he once said, at a family dinner when I was 16, that he hoped I wasn't going to turn into one of those women who hid behind their career because they didn't know how to be with people. I remember looking at my plate and not saying anything. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. She always knew. I got into Emory for undergrad. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. Actually, it was an email, but I printed it out because I wanted to hold it. I stood in our kitchen and read it 3 times. Then I walked into the living room and told my father. He was watching football. "Emory," he said, like he was testing the word. "Is that the expensive one?" I told him I had financial aid. I told him I'd applied for every scholarship I could find. I told him this was a genuinely good school with a strong pre-med program and that I had worked so hard for this. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was trying to look supportive without committing to enthusiasm. "Just don't forget that a degree doesn't make you better than anyone," he said. That was it. That was the whole thing. I drove myself to Atlanta in August with my mother in the passenger seat and a trunk full of plastic storage bins. My father had a work thing he couldn't move. That was fine. That was just how it was. Medical school was Johns Hopkins. I got in on my first application cycle, which I later found out was something that happened for about 15% of applicants. I called home when I found out. My mother had been gone for 2 years by then, so it was just my father. He said, "Baltimore? That's far." I said yes. He said, "Well, I hope you know what you're getting into." I said I did. He said to drive safe. That was the whole call. I sat in my apartment for a long time afterward, holding my phone, trying to figure out what I had expected. I kept landing on the same answer. Nothing specific. I just expected something. Something that felt like what I had seen other parents do when their kids called with good news. Something that lasted longer than 40 seconds. Residency was 4 years in Atlanta, which meant I was home technically, though home was now a hospital that I barely left, and an apartment I mostly used for sleeping. I worked 80-hour weeks. I saw things that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I learned how to hold a dying child's hand and still be present, still be functional, still be the doctor in the room, even when everything in you wanted to fall apart. My father knew I was in residency. We had dinner maybe 4 times a year. He would ask how work was going, and I would try to explain what my days were like. And he would listen with the patient expression of someone sitting through a PowerPoint presentation they didn't request. Then he would pivot every single time to asking about my cousin Denise. Denise had gotten married at 25 to a man named Reginald, who had his own landscaping company. By the time I finished residency, they had 2 kids and a house with a wraparound porch in Savannah. My father talked about that wraparound porch the way other people talked about national monuments. Reginald built that porch himself, he told me once. That's great, I said. He's a real provider, my father said, and I understood that this was not just about the porch. I did not have a Reginald. I had not had time to find a Reginald. I had been in the hospital learning how to save children's lives, which I thought might count for something. It did not appear to count for the thing my father was measuring. I became an attending at 31. Full physician, full salary, my own patients, my own residence. I moved into a condo in Midtown Atlanta that I paid for myself. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the skyline that made me feel, every morning, like I had actually built something. I still called my father on Sundays. I don't know exactly why, habit maybe, or some version of hope that I couldn't fully extinguish. The calls were always more or less the same. He would ask if I was eating enough. I would say yes. He would ask when I was going to settle down. I would deflect. He would mention Denise. I would listen. One Sunday he told me that Denise and Reginald were thinking about adding a second story to their house. That's nice, I said. It's a real investment, he said. They're building something that'll last. I was quiet for a moment. I bought a condo, I said. In Midtown. With a view. Condos aren't real estate, he said. You're just renting the air. I stared at my floor-to-ceiling windows for a long moment. Okay, I said. I just want you to think about the future, he said. I think about the future every single day, I said. And I meant it in a way he couldn't hear. Because the futures I thought about were the futures of 6-year-olds with sepsis, and 8-year-olds with head injuries, and every child who came through my doors at 2 in the morning. He meant a different kind of future. I knew that. The thing I haven't said yet is that I was also, during all of this, building something else. It started as a small project 3 years into my attending position. A free weekend clinic for pediatric patients in underserved communities south of Atlanta. I partnered with 2 colleagues from Grady and a nonprofit that provided the space, and we ran it out of a community center in Forest Park on the first Saturday of every month. Then every Saturday. Then we expanded to 2 locations. By the time this story reaches its pivot point, we were operating 4 clinics, had a staff of 12 full-time employees, and had received a federal grant from the Department of Health and Human Services for just under $2 million to expand our model to 3 additional cities. We had been featured in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and in a piece on NPR. The governor's office had reached out about a formal state partnership. I had not told my father any of this. That probably sounds strange. Let me explain. I had tried, early on, to share the clinic with my father. I mentioned it at one of our dinners when we were maybe 8 months in. I told him we'd served over 300 kids so far, that we were trying to fill a gap in preventive care, that I was really proud of what we were building. He listened. Then he said, "Are you getting paid for that?" I said it was volunteer work. He said, "Adrienne, you went to medical school to work for free on weekends?" I said it wasn't about the money. He said, "That's easy to say when you make what you make." After that, I stopped telling him. Not out of anger, exactly. More out of a kind of self-preservation. There are things you stop sharing when you realize they will always come back smaller. You learn to protect certain rooms of yourself and only let people in if you trust them not to break what's inside. The event happened on a Saturday in October. The governor was hosting a luncheon at the Georgia World Congress Center in downtown Atlanta, a health equity summit with about 400 attendees, including hospital administrators, public health officials, state legislators, and representatives from several federal agencies. I had been invited as a featured speaker. The nonprofit I'd built was being recognized with a Public Health Impact Award, and I was presenting a formal proposal for the statewide expansion with members of the governor's staff. I had been preparing for this for 3 months. I was wearing my good charcoal blazer, the one I bought specifically for things like this, and I had gotten my hair done the day before, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I looked exactly like what I was. My father called that morning while I was in the car. He didn't know about the event. He was calling because it was Saturday and sometimes he called on Saturdays. He asked if I was free for lunch. I told him I had something. He asked what. I hesitated. And then, for reasons I still think about, I told him. I told him about the summit, the award, the proposal, the governor's office. I tried to say it calmly, matter-of-factly, like I was reading from a schedule. There was a pause on the line. The governor, he said. His health office, yes. Another pause. Is Denise going to be there? I held the steering wheel a little tighter. No, I said. This is a public health event. She owns a floral shop. I know what she does, he said, and I could hear the old defensiveness in his voice, the one that appeared whenever he thought I was talking down to him. I just thought maybe she'd been invited as a community person or something. She wasn't invited, I said. Okay, he said. Well, that sounds like a big deal. It's a big deal. Don't let it go to your head, he said. I looked at the skyline coming into view through my windshield. The sun was coming off the glass buildings in long gold lines. Okay, Dad, I said. Call me later, he said. I will, I said. I hung up and sat with that for the rest of the drive. The event was everything it was supposed to be. I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. I was. I had presented in grand rounds. I had given lectures to residents. But this was different. There were cameras. There were microphones. There were people in the room who could actually reshape health policy in this state. And I was there to convince them that what we had built was worth replicating. I think I did that. I think I more than did that. The award portion happened mid-afternoon, in the main ballroom with the chandeliers and the round tables with white tablecloths. The Commissioner of Public Health introduced us, talked about our clinic model, cited our patient numbers and outcomes data. Then he turned to the audience and said, I'd like to invite Dr. Adrienne Cole to come up and accept this recognition on behalf of her team. And I walked up. There were 400 people in that room. They stood. I had not expected that. I stood at the podium with the award, which was heavier than it looked, a glass thing that caught the light. And I thought about Elijah, the 7-year-old I'd lost the day of my grandmother's funeral. I thought about my mother squeezing my hand under the table at 16. I thought about every kid who had come into our Saturday clinic with an ear infection or undiagnosed asthma, or a rash their parents couldn't afford to have looked at. I thanked my team. I thanked my co-founders. I thanked the nonprofit. I did not cry, which I was proud of, but it was close. Afterward, in the atrium during the reception, a woman in a navy blazer approached me. She introduced herself as the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Health Strategy. Her name was Dr. Phelps. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, What you've built is exactly what we've been looking for. I want to talk seriously about what a state partnership would look like. We talked for 45 minutes. I had a glass of sparkling water and the best chicken satay I've ever eaten. And I talked about pediatric access gaps and rural expansion and mobile clinic models. And she listened and took notes on her phone and said exactly, and tell me more times than I could count. It was the best professional conversation I had ever had in my life. My father called again at 5:30. I was in the parking structure, still coming down from the adrenaline, pulling my blazer off in the heat because October in Atlanta can still be brutal. How'd it go? He asked. I told him it went well. Did you get your picture taken with the governor? He wasn't there in person, I said, but his team was. Oh, he said. I thought he'd be there. He had another commitment, I said. Well, he said, it still sounds nice. 400 people, a federal grant, a standing ovation, 45 minutes with the deputy director. And my father's word for it was nice. It was more than nice, I said, and I surprised myself by saying it. Usually I let it go. Usually I just nodded along to whatever diminishment came my way and tucked the real thing away somewhere safe. I'm sure it was, he said, in a tone that suggested he wished of no such thing. I sat in my car in the parking structure for a moment. Dad, I said, I want to say something. Okay, I've been a doctor for 3 years. I run 4 free clinics. I just received a public health award at a state-level summit, and I'm about to partner with the governor's office to expand our program to 6 cities. I'm telling you this not to brag. I'm telling you this because you're my father, and I've never once felt like any of it was enough for you. Silence. That's not fair, I said. But I needed to say it. More silence. I always told you to do your best, he said. You told me not to let it go to my head, I said. This morning, 3 hours before I walked into the biggest professional moment of my life. He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. I just didn't want you to get arrogant, he said finally. I know, I said. I know that's what you thought you were doing. I didn't say the rest. I didn't say that there's a difference between humility and smallness. that the people who love you should want you to stand up as tall as you actually are, and hand you a ladder, if they can, not pull at your ankles. I didn't say that I had been trying to show him something for 15 years and I was tired. I didn't say that I understood, somewhere under all of it, that this was about him, about the things he never got to be, the recognition he never received, the dreams that got traded in for a steady income and a house in central Georgia, that his discomfort with my success wasn't about me at all. I didn't say any of that. I just said, "I love you, Dad." He said, "I love you too." I said I'd call him next Sunday. He said, "Okay. Here's the part I need to tell you, because it happened 2 weeks later and it's the part that finally shifted something." I was at a Saturday clinic, the Forest Park location, which was the original, the one with the mural on the wall that a local artist painted of kids playing in a field, bright colors, a sun so yellow it almost hurt to look at. We were having a heavy morning. Flu season was starting early, and we'd already seen 43 patients by noon. My father showed up at 1:30. I don't know how he found out where we were. I think he must have looked it up after our call, maybe called my cousin Denise, who knew more about my life than I realized. He just appeared in the waiting room in his church clothes, dark slacks, a button-down shirt, the jacket he wore to important things, holding a paper bag from a soul food place on the south side that I used to love as a kid. One of my nurses found me between patients. "Dr. Cole," she said, "there's a gentleman in the waiting room who says he's your father." I walked out and there he was. He looked older than I usually let myself notice. His hair was more gray than I remembered. He was standing very straight, the way he always did, but there was something uncertain in his face, something I hadn't seen there before. He held up the paper bag. "I brought lunch," he said. "Figured you hadn't eaten." I stood there for a second, not sure what to do with this. Not sure what it meant or what it was going to cost me to accept it. "We're still seeing patients," I said. "I know," he said. "I'll wait." And he did. He sat in one of the plastic chairs in the waiting room, the same chairs as the families with sick kids, no special treatment, no waiting in a back office, and he sat there for 2 hours. I passed by him twice between patients and both times he was watching what was happening in the clinic, with an expression I had never seen on his face. I finished the last patient at 3:45, a 4-year-old with an ear infection and a mother who had been awake for 2 nights straight. I prescribed the amoxicillin, explained the dosing, sent them out with a follow-up appointment, and then I walked back to the waiting room. My father stood up when he saw me. He looked at the mural on the wall, then at my badge, then at my face. "This is what you built?" he said. "This is one of 4, I said. He nodded, the slow nod, but different this time, not the polite nod of someone waiting to change the subject. He was nodding like he was taking it in, like his brain was adjusting to something. "How many kids did you see today?" he asked. 51, I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have loved this," he said. That's the sentence that got me, not the apology. He didn't really give me a formal apology, not then, not in so many words, but that sentence, "Your mother would have loved this." Because he was right. She would have. She would have been there every Saturday if she could, checking kids in at the front desk, making the mothers feel comfortable, probably learning everyone's names in the first 20 minutes. And my father, for the first time, was seeing what she would have seen. I said, "I know." He handed me the paper bag, still warm somehow. The fried cat thing I would have ordered as a 16-year-old. "Can I see the rest of it?" he asked. "The other rooms?" I took him on a small tour. Exam rooms, the supply station, the vaccination area. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. He didn't say anything diminishing. Not once. He didn't mention Denise. He didn't ask about condos or Reginald, or whether I was eating enough, or when I was going to settle down. He just looked at the thing I had built and let it be what it was. That was 8 months ago. My father and I are not a different kind of people now. We don't talk every day. He still says things sometimes that I have to let roll past me. Last month he mentioned, completely unprompted, that Reginald had started doing commercial landscaping contracts and was really growing something. I heard it and felt the old pull of it, the comparison, the implication, the weight of the thing he wasn't quite saying. But it lands differently now. I think part of it is that I finally said the thing I needed to say, in the parking structure with my blazer in my lap, in October. I stopped carrying it silently. I put it down in front of him and let him see it, and whatever he decided to do with it was his business. And part of it is that he came. He sat in that plastic chair for 2 hours because he didn't know what else to do. And that was his version of an apology. It wasn't the kind I might have written for him if I were writing a script. But it was his, and it was real, and I've learned that real imperfect things are worth more than perfect imaginary ones. My mother used to say that people show you who they are in the small moments, not the big ones. The big ones are too dramatic. People perform in the big ones. It's the small ones that tell the truth. My father showing up in his church clothes with a bag of fried catfish and sitting in a plastic chair for 2 hours. That was a small moment. That was him, telling the truth in the only language he had. I'm not waiting for his validation anymore. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling this story because I got what I needed from him, and now everything is healed and resolved and I feel complete. Life is not a movie. Fathers who spend 30 years constructing certain beliefs don't dismantle them in a waiting room on a Saturday afternoon. What changed is me. I stopped needing the award to mean something to him, in order for it to mean something to me. I stopped translating my own life into terms I thought he could accept. I stopped making myself smaller so he'd feel comfortable enough to stay in the room. The clinic is still running. The state partnership is moving forward. We broke ground last month on a 5th location, out in Lithonia, which is a community that has been without a pediatric clinic within reasonable driving distance for years. I was there for the groundbreaking in boots that got absolutely destroyed by the Georgia mud, and I didn't care at all. My father saw the picture I posted online afterward. He commented 3 words, "That's my daughter." 3 words, not a speech, not an apology that covered everything, not the acknowledgement I used to lie awake wishing for, just 3 words, and somehow, finally, they were enough.